Hi, and welcome to Principles of Macroeconomics. This is Module 3.1, and in this module, we'll start our discussion of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. In this module, we're going to focus on discussing the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And what this model tells us is that it gives us a snapshot of what's happening in the economy. Specifically, we can see why and how an economy experiences both long-run economic growth as well as short-run economic fluctuations. It helps explain why and how we observe changes in the price level in the economy and how changes in output respond to shocks in our economy. So in this module, we will focus specifically on explaining aggregate demand. And when we look at aggregate demand, it's going to be the sum of the demand for all goods and services from households, firms, the government, and from foreign entities. So when we look at aggregate demand, as you can see here, it's a downward sloping line. What aggregate demand is showing is the relationship between consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports, and its impact on output. What we observe here is that, in fact, the relationship between the price and aggregate demand is driven by the influence of price on consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. What we observe is that at a point such as point B, we have a lower price level, and therefore the demand for goods and services is going to be higher at a point such as point Y. On the other hand, if we're talking about a high price level, such as at point A, at a high price level, such as P1, the demand for goods and services is going to be lower, such as at Y1. So this inverse relationship between the price level and aggregate demand, or the demand for goods and services in our economy, is similar to what we've already seen when we talked about supply and demand in the first place. A downward sloping demand tells us that at low price levels we have high demand, and at high price levels we have low demand. But in this case here, we're talking about aggregate demand. So we're aggregating everything in the entire economy, the demand for all of our goods and services. So we want to explain why we have this downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And this comes from specifically three effects. The first is what we call the wealth effect. And the wealth effect links the response of consumption to different price levels. Specifically, what we observe is that at a low price level, the value of money is higher. Essentially, at a low price level, what that tells us is the amount of money that you need in your wallet to buy the same amount of goods and services you don't need quite as much money. So therefore, each dollar in your wallet is valued a little bit higher. It's worth a little bit more. So therefore, you feel a little bit wealthier because you have the same amount of money in your pocket, but each dollar can buy you a little bit more because we have a low price level. Therefore, this is going to cause consumers to be more eager to spend their money, and therefore they're going to feel wealthier and demand more. So therefore, because consumers are compelled to spend more at lower price levels, we're going to see a correspondence between lower price levels and higher levels of consumption spending. The next effect is what we call the interest rate effect. And here at lower price levels, households are going to reduce their money holdings by lending some of that money out, leading to a fall in interest rates. We're going to talk about specifically this relationship a little bit later on in Module 4. But what we know is that when price levels are low, people might buy the same amount of goods and services, but they have some money left over. They're going to put that money into interest-bearing assets. By doing so, when they put that money into interest-bearing assets, this is going to lead to a fall in the interest rate. When that happens, loans become cheaper, and firms are going to be incentivized to borrow more and to purchase investment goods, investment capital goods. So when we have lower interest rates, firms are more likely to borrow to expand their businesses, and we see an increase in investment spending as a result. So therefore, what we observe is that at lower price levels, we're going to have higher levels of investment spending. The last effect is what we call the exchange rate effect, and this piggybacks off of the interest rate effect. Specifically, we know that at lower price levels, this is going to correspond to lower interest rates. So when we have lower interest rates domestically, foreign investors and investors in our country are going to be looking for a higher return elsewhere. So with lower interest rates domestically, both domestic and foreign investors may move some of their assets abroad if there are higher interest rates in different countries. This is going to lead to what we call a net capital outflow, and that causes an increase in the demand for foreign currency and a decrease in the demand for US currency or domestic currency. As a result, the domestic currency, or in this case the US dollar, depreciates. When that happens, that tells us that exports from the US to other countries are cheaper, and imports from other countries to the US are more expensive. As a result, exports increase and imports decrease. And net exports, remember, are the difference between exports and imports. So if exports increase and imports decrease, that tells us that net exports overall are rising. So at lower price levels, net exports are going to be higher because of the exchange rate effect. So now we want to know what happens if we have shifts in aggregate demand. Where are these shifts coming from? Remember, we can define our aggregate demand curve as consumption, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. So therefore, we're going to observe shifts in the aggregate demand curve when we have some factor changing in our economy that's going to cause a shift in or a change in consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports. So let's take a look. Changes in consumption are going to come from a situation where families across the economy are increasing spending on goods and services. This would cause an increase in our aggregate demand. So there's some factor in our economy that's changing that's causing households overall to increase their spending on goods and services. A change in investment would reflect that firms overall are buying new capital goods and new machines. They're trying to expand their business facilities. Therefore, this is also telling us that we would have an increase in aggregate demand at every price level. A change in government spending tells us that the government may be spending more, maybe building new infrastructure, improving the education system, or maybe even buying new weapons. This increase in government spending tells us that aggregate demand also increases at each price point, causing a shift out of the aggregate demand curve. And lastly, a change in net exports. Let's say exports from the US to other countries increase. That tells us, all else equal, exports are increasing, meaning that net exports may be increasing if there's no change in imports, and therefore aggregate demand will also be increasing. So what we observe is that when we have a change in any of the four components in aggregate demand, we're going to have a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So what have we learned so far in this module? Well, we know that the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model are going to give us a reflection of what's happening in the economy. They're going to help us explain exactly why we have short-run fluctuations and long-run economic growth. Here we've talked about specifically aggregate demand, and we know that this is showing the demand for all goods and services in the economy from all of the households, firms, the government, and foreigners in the economy. And we know that changes in the aggregate demand are going to come specifically from changes in one of the four components in our output equation. Thanks so much for joining me in Module 3.1 on aggregate demand.